Hey everyone. Now we're going to be going over moving linearly, which simply means moving forward and backward. So there are actually two different ways to do this in the EV3 Mindstorm software, both of which are called Move Steering and Move Tank. If you can notice, both of these are under the Action tab, and the Action tab simply corresponds to actions that will make the robot move forward or backward. So let's get started. So in order to use the Move Tank block, all we have to do is click on it, drag it all the way up until you can see a little gray shadow form right over here. And once you see that shadow, you can just drop it and it'll attach automatically. So once these two blocks are connected, this means that the program has a kind of full flow. So let's say if the block was over here and you tried to run the program, you wouldn't be able to. If you click this block, nothing would happen because these two aren't connected. So in order to actually run a program, you need to make sure that all of your blocks are physically connected. And you can see that once you have this little gray shadow and they're fully connected. So if you can look over here, there are several different icons on this block. So let's start with the most basic one. Right over here, we have power left and power right. So what this corresponds to is essentially how much power the robot is going to move with, how fast, essentially. And there are various different values that you can adjust this to. So the way you can do this is by changing the slider, or just simply typing in the value yourself. And the values go from all the way from negative 100 to positive 100. So, what do you think happens if we set both of these to 0? Likewise, what do you think will happen if we set both of these to negative 100? And lastly, what do you think will happen if we set both of these values to positive 100? So for the first one, if we set both of these to 0, since there's no power on the robot, despite the fact that there's one rotation, it's not going to be able to move forward at all. If we change this all the way to negative 100 for both the left and right motors, it's going to go backwards at 100 power for one rotation. So this is the way that you actually make your robot go backwards. You can adjust the power, and you can make it negative. On the other hand, if we made both of these values positive, that would simply mean it would go forward for one rotation at 100 power. So I briefly alluded to this, and right over here is the amount of rotations. So currently it's set to one rotation, and one rotation is simply 360 degrees on this motor over here. So if you actually take a look at your large motor, the one that kind of looks like a chicken leg, you can actually turn the little red wheel all the way around. And the way you know if you turn something over 360 degrees is if you grab it if you turn it by one of the holes, make sure it goes all the way around until it comes back to the place where you started. That is one rotation. That's 360 degrees. So as I was saying, we have on for rotations. These are several different operating modes corresponding to the Move Tank block. We have on for rotations. We have on for degrees, which simply says, 360 degrees is one rotation. So it's basically a different way of using rotations. We're not going to be using this too much right now. We also have on for seconds, and as you would infer, this just changes the amount of seconds, so we can run at 100 power for 10 seconds, we can do 5 seconds, anything like that. And then we have just on. So, as you can see, when we change our operating mode to on, there won't be any seconds, there won't be any rotations. All this means is that the robot is going to go forward at all times. It's just never going to stop, unless you manually stop the program. And lastly, we have off, which will just stop the robot entirely. So for now, we're just going to keep it on for rotations. There's one more thing that I didn't totally talk about, and there are two different ways of braking, essentially. Over here we have brake, and then over here we have coast. Basically, for the most part, we're going to be using brake, and what that means is that immediately after one rotation is done, it'll stop, whereas coast means that immediately after the one rotation is done, it'll move for a little bit, and it'll kind of gradually come to a stop. But for our purposes, just straight up brake is going to be significantly more accurate, so we're just going to be using that for now. Alright, so that's pretty much all for the move tank block. If you guys want to, you can experiment with different speeds, but for now, I would suggest that keep both of these values the same, power left and power right, and we're going to see what happens if we actually change, or if we put different values for power left and power right in a future video. So experiment with that a little bit. Alright, now we're going to move on to the move steering block. So the move steering block is very similar to the move tank block, and you can choose whichever one you'd like. It doesn't necessarily matter in the majority of programs. So as you can see over here, similar to the move tank block, we have different operating modes. So on for rotations, on for degrees, on for seconds, on and off. Just like the move tank block. Over here, this is the one difference, and this is a steering value. So currently the steering is set to 0. And as you can see over here, there's an icon that has a straight line. So when the steering is set to 0, how do you think it'll move? Like forward, to the left, to the right? Yes. So the steering, when set to 0, is just simply going to move forward. But the good thing about the steering block is that you can actually adjust these values to make the robot take a U-turn, a full 360, just take a right, take a left if you make the values negative, or take a left 360. So essentially, this steering value makes it so that the robot can kind of turn in different ways. Yeah, that's essentially all it is. But for our purposes, when we're just moving forward, we just want to keep the steering value at 0. And then over here, instead of, you saw in the move tank block, there are 2 different values for power left and power right. Here, there's only one consolidated value just for power. And as usual, we can adjust these values. We can make it negative 100, anywhere from negative 100 to 100. We can make it 0. And as you can see over here, we can adjust the amount of rotations. We can do 5 rotations. We can change this to on for seconds, make it 10 seconds. So just like that. So in that sense, it's very similar to the move steering block. And before I forget, there's actually one other way to move forward, or rather to move backward in EV3. So as you all know by now, if you turn this on for rotations, put power at whatever, 50, and then you keep this on one rotation, if you want to move backward, you simply change this value to negative. So this means that the power is going to be negative 50 as opposed to 50, and as a result, the robot is going to move backward because the power is going to be going in the opposite direction. But there's actually another way to do this while keeping the power positive, and the way you do this is by making the amount of rotations negative. So why do you guys think this happens? Right, so the reason why the robot moves backwards when you set the amount of rotations to -1 is because it'd be rotating in the opposite direction. So when you have your amount of rotations set to 1, that means that it's going to go 1 rotation forward, but if it's a -1, that means it's going to go 1 rotation backward. And as usual, you can set this to whatever number you want. If you want to make it go backward, maybe for 5 rotations, then you just put -5. So that's just one more way to do this. Alright, so for your challenge, what your challenge is going to be is to move forward in a straight line at 50 power for 5 rotations, and then move backwards at 50 power for 5 rotations. So ideally, your robot should come back to the place where it started at the end of the program. So try doing this, and do it using both the move steering block and the move tank block. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next lesson.